Hello, everybody. So I hope you're all enjoying the surreal odyssey that is Steve Erickson's Shadowbahn. Uh, Upon me making this video, you should all be to at least page 25, hopefully. Hopefully. Uh, if you're not there, you should try to get there as quickly as possible. Try to maintain the reading schedule despite how crazy things are. So this is the second video of four for the recalibration / spring break sessions. So again, you have the option to respond to any two of these four that will ultimately be made. And the focus of all of them, I think, will be Shadowbahn, which is, I hope you're enjoying it. As I said, it's a very dense, layered, rich novel. I think it's a wild and exciting ride. It's funny. It's super weird, and there's such a great deal going on that there's. I for one feel a tendency to try to talk about everything at once, but as you're finding and trying to limit your topics, research to 7 to 10 pages, you really can't talk about all the aspects of a text in a short space, in a small space. So whether your text is a novel or a historical event or some social phenomenon, some law, some practice, you can only talk about a little bit of it at a time and try to really comment on the thing in its entirety through a deep analysis of its particular parts. And of course, if it's a text that is in any way worthwhile writing about, each of those particular parts will offer up a variety of possible interpretations. And I think that Shadowbahn certainly offers no shortage of interpretation. I think there's a lot of different ways you can read this novel. And the aspect I want to try to concentrate on with this video is the setting of the novel and what it is on a kind of direct, literal, concrete basis, but whatever that means in a novel like Shadowbahn, direct and concrete and literal. I think I'm using those terms with a grain of salt with this book because I think it's hard to take anything in a particularly concrete, literal way in a book like this. But that's, I want to talk about setting on the kind of basic level, and also on a more symbolic level, because everything in this book is kind of operating on those two levels at one time. There's the story. There is a story. There's a narrative to follow. It works on its own kind of internal logic much of the time. But there's this sort of reality unto itself within that. But then there's this other layer of symbolism, of everything is working on a representational kind of level, signifying to a meaning beyond the direct events of the narrative. And sometimes, it's all overlapped and intertwined and interlacing, and there's slippages and deep, strange deep dives into certain things that seem solid, to put it that way. But anyway, there's very different. There's various different tools from which we can approach the idea of setting and its importance to Shadowbahn. And I think the best way to do that is just kind of look at some of the different settings and how they operate and what they might be representing. So, for example, the first kind of broad arena that we come into with this novel, the initial broad settings. So we can talk about broad settings, and then we'll move into kind of more particular settings. And the first kind of broad setting, I think we can call, or at least I'm going to call you, alternate America #1, or perhaps Shadow America #1 might be more fitting. And as I said in the last video, if you watched that, and as is obvious from reading the book anyway, it's not immediately apparent that we're in an alternate America. There's no big banner on the front page that says this is a world in which Barack Obama does not exist. Instead, we have very subtle clues. So, for example, on page 16, there's a sentence that is talking about, the towers have appeared and nobody's quite sure what to make of them, and nobody's entered, and they're trying to decide who enters. And there's a brief line, a sentence that says, occasional demands from some quarters that the president should enter clash with counter demands that she shouldn't. So just a very simple pronoun there indicates to us that there's a woman president, which hasn't happened, unfortunately, and the America of our reality yet. So that's a first clue. There's also clues before that. There's mentions of the flags of disunion. Now I don't know about you, but when I first read flags of disunion before on those first few mentions, I just thought they were like Confederate flags on my first read, which even that seems a little bit. It's kind of a ding, kind of an alarm signal, because why would there be so many? He's not in. First of all, he's not in the South, where you would expect to see Confederate flags, if anywhere. And perhaps even in the South, you wouldn't expect to see them with the consistency that they are appearing. Aaron, the truck driver with whom our story opens, he's the first person who kind of notices a flag of disunion, and then they become more frequent. And he's in the West. He's in South Dakota. He's in the Badlands where the Twin Towers appear. And so it's a little bit strange he would see a Confederate flag, if that's how you took it. And that is how I first took it. But of course, once we get a little bit deeper into the story, we realize that these aren't Confederate flags per se, that they are flags of disunion. That is to say that they represent territories that are at least attempting to secede from the Union, from the United States of America. So this is a ruptured United States. It's reflective of our own in many ways. But it's not our own. It's rooted in our own. It's splintered off into this other reality. But of course, there are plenty of things in common with our reality. But where this one has splintered off, there's plenty of civil conflict, almost to the point of being a civil war. It doesn't quite say that it's a civil war yet, but we do get passages about like secessionists battling with the National Guard over control of trains. There's mention of like a boxcar burning that Parker sees in the distance. We're not sure if it was the National Guard who lit it on fire. The secessionists, I don't think it really matters. The point is just to indicate that there's this discord that is prevalent throughout the United States. Even to the point that, as we can see on page 96 through 99, Parker and Zima stop off at this gas station. She goes into the bathroom. Parker is outside. He's having a conversation with the gas station attendant, who has a diploma in astrophysics, but he's working at this gas station, which we can ask a lot of questions about. That his diploma is notably from the California Institute of Technology. If you look on page 97, that's where I'm getting this. So maybe it doesn't hold value in a place like Muleshoe, which seems to be it's a ruptured territory. It's separated itself from the Union, or at least trying to. Well, there's a lot that we don't really know at this point. Maybe we won't find out. But there's a lot that isn't made directly obvious. It's just kind of being part of the magic of the way Erikson writes is he's just kind of delivering these strange details in a very kind of matter-of-fact way. So it seems very natural, and these disparities between this reality and our own creep up on us, and they don't seem shocking. So, you know, in a certain way, this is kind of overtly a fantastic, maybe even a fantasy novel in certain sense. You know, not swords and daggers and fairies and that kind of fantasy, but you know, there's fantastical elements. There's elements of fantasy. There's magic in a certain, you know, just the fact that the Twin Towers are appearing in South Dakota Badlands, you know, that makes this a kind of magical novel. But then there are other parts that feel very realistic at first. And it's only once we read on and get these sort of very subtly delivered hints and descriptions, and once we're already kind of immersed in this world, that we begin to realize that the jumping off point even is not you know, it's not jumping off from a reality that is at one with our own, although it is certainly representative of our own in many ways. You know, I think that so bear in mind, Erikson, this book came out in 2017, right? So if it was released by the publisher 2017, that means he was probably writing it. I don't know, but I'm going to say like 2014, 15, maybe 16 even. But he was writing this when Barack Obama was president, and he must have, I think he identified certain things in our national psyche that have now come to the fore. No matter where you fall on the political spectrum, I think we all have to admit that we are living in an increasingly divided nation. It's become increasingly polarized. And you know, that's not to say that one side or the other is wrong or right. You know, I have my political opinions, but it's not my place here to try to impose those on any of you. But it's just observation that we are living in increasingly divided and polarized times. And that was kind of dormant, I think, or at least the recognition of it, the realization of this polarization dormant in the years leading up to 2016. But I guess it was there kind of simmering under the surface, and Erickson seems to have kind of tapped into this. And he's representing that through this depiction of an America that has become divided in a even more severe sense, where territories are seceding from the Union. And we don't really know why at that point. By page 125, we don't know why these territories are seceding. But they are, even to the point that, as it's on page 96, it talks about, Parker is paying the gas station attendant in this town of Muleshoe, which is a ruptured territory. He's paying him with US dollars, and it says ruptured territory or no, that is Parker, he's learned that no one has any compunction about taking US dollars, preferring them to whatever passes for this Union currency. So whatever, we can take that as these territories, these secessionist territories, these disunion territories, these ruptured territories, they're not recognized as official in any way, or so we can gather from this. But they're trying to develop their own separate society, and currency, that's one manifestation of that. To have your currency recognized by other, if a currency is recognized by other nations, that legitimizes it. If it's recognized outside of those nations, so like that is to say, if you could exchange it at an airport or a boundary point between the two nations, that legitimizes the currency, and if you legitimize the currency, you legitimize that nation, that country. So these territories are not legitimized in any way yet, and they're still battling it out with the national government. So of course, kind of the central starting dynamic of this novel is that into this reality, this setting of a ruptured America, appear the Twin Towers. So them having them appear anywhere is an odd thing, to say the least. It's even more odd that they appear in the Badlands of South Dakota. Nothing else around them. There's nothing else there. Manhattan is certainly not there. The other buildings of Manhattan are certainly not there. And one of the towers who should appear, but Jesse Presley. So if you don't know, Elvis Presley had a twin brother who was stillborn, who died at childbirth, and that was Jesse Presley. But in these Twin Towers, we have a Jesse Presley who has grown into adulthood, and instead of him being stillborn, Elvis Presley, his twin brother, was the one who died at childbirth. And Jesse has these memories of living. It's hard to even say if they're memories or dreams, or if it's an alternate universe. It's hard to even say, even within the narrative the narrative confines of Shadowbahn. It's hard to even say if these are, what these are, whether they're shadows, they're dreams, or an alternate reality. And it's hard to make that determination because it's hard to say what Jesse Presley is in this world and these narrative parameters. At least at this point, we're not really sure what he is. Perhaps he himself is a dream, or he's a visitor from an alternate reality. We can't really say what he is yet in terms of what he is within the confines, the parameters of the story in which he comes into being. If nothing else, we can consider him a textual entity. If we grant to this text a certain kind of existence, we can. It has an existence in our minds, and Jesse Presley is, as a textual entity, he takes on a kind of existence as a figure in our mindscapes. But not to digress, let's stick with setting. So at the end of part 1, Jesse Presley is, I'll show this to you again. If you watched the last video, you'll see it, or if you've checked out course documents already, you will have seen this. But Jesse Presley, he's locked in the tower, basically. He can't get out. He tries to go down. The doors are locked. So he can't get out by going down. So instead he goes up, and he rushes to the roof, and he sees through I'll read you the passage here. Jumps out onto the roof on page 73, and he tumbles out onto the tower's open rooftop. This is page 73 now. He tumbles out onto the tower's open rooftop into a foyer of miasma and night where all noise collapses in on itself. Somewhere higher off the planet than almost anyone has walked, short of the moon, Jesse has just enough time to reach above him and touch the black arched ceiling of the globe. Ever so briefly, he takes in the roof's layout, centered by its railed island platform that's surrounded by an empty concrete moat, and at the far rim, a fence once placed so as to prevent jumpers, or at least anyone jumping for any reason other than oncoming aircraft. Mid-air in the moment's leap from the escalator into the light, Jesse gasps. Mid-air in the moment's leap, he feels a gust blow him outside his twin brother's life into his own. His twin brother being Elvis. Squinting hard into the portal of light before him, he remembers a photo shoot on 47th Street before the studio moved to Union Square. And of course, the image that he's been seeing in the light these past few months is of himself. Two of him, side by side. And I'll keep reading that passage, but I'll show you the image to which this is referring. And if you want to spend more time with this, you just go to course documents, and you see it right there. So this is a piece of art by Andy Warhol, and he did other ones that are similar in color, different colors, and or with more Elvises. So this one just has two Elvises, but he did other ones with more Elvises. But this is the one to which this is referring. Or if you know anything about Andy Warhol and his work, he would do kind of variations and riffs on the same image. So there's different variations on this, but for practical purposes, this is what it's referring to. So Jesse's on the roof. He sees this picture through the fence, and he sees two of them side by side, or so Jesse thought when the photographer took the double image all those years ago, wanting, as the photographer always did, to make the most of his superstars. The double image reproduced and silk-screened in variations of color. Both twins postured with six-gun drawn from a holster as though in a Western gunfight. No cowboy hat, long-sleeve buttoned shirt and boots, and jeans double-belted with holster slung low on the right hip. Looking not square into the camera, but ever so slightly off-right. This image that Jesse now surveys is silver and black. All right, so this is the one. This is silver and black. But for the first time since that photo shoot decades before, Jesse realizes what he never realized, that they were never double images of him at all. So you and me then, baby bro, he says, staring at the identical twins glistening in the tower rooftop portal. It was you and me all along, huh? Never, he realizes, was just me, and me at all should have known. Andy, that being Andy Warhol, Andy always was up to something. Manipulative little albino twat. He knew all along it was you right there beside me. And as Jesse steps through the glowing door on the tower rooftop into another place and another time, he lapses mid-step from the consciousness of one split moment into the consciousness of another. Through his head blows a black, soundless wind that, for the first time, justifies every moment of him. He barely can be sure now that he's ever been in the tower at all. There, beneath the ceiling of the world, where nothing lies in the distant dark but moonscape and the twinkling of thousands of flaming lights gathered at the tower's base. For the first time since that real flashing glimpse outside the 93rd floor window of the airliner coming toward him, he's ecstatic. The towers and their future vanish behind him. The single fiery siren note that has beckoned him goes up in its own flames. Embers of incinerated music scatter on the rooftop from where, seconds ago, crossing a threshold similar to the one from which Sheriff Ray Jordan recoiled more than 100 floors below, Jesse, the Shadowbahn, jumped and, in the eyes of anyone else who might have been on the tower rooftop to witness it, disappeared into thin air. All right, so with that, we kind of get another broad setting, as it were, which, for the sake of discussion here, I am going to refer to as alternate America number 2, or again, perhaps more appropriately, Shadow America number 2. And the first thing that happens when we find him there, when we join up with Jesse Presley in Shadow America number 2, he's encountering one Candy Darling. So you might have heard of Candy Darling before. She was part of Andy Warhol's factory circuit, a transgender individual. If you want to learn more about Candy Darling, which I highly recommend that you do. Oh, hold on. Let me turn you on my screen here. The more Andy Warhol's factory and everybody in it is worth knowing. Whether you like the art or not. I myself wasn't a big fan until I went to the Andy Warhol retrospective at the Whitney Museum last year, and it was fantastic. There's a great depth to his art. But even if you don't really like it, even if you don't like his art for what it is in and of itself, just as a figure in a certain cultural paradigm, it is definitely worth looking into. It's definitely worth learning a bit about Andy Warhol's factory, and Kay Darling being a representative of that, who is a character now in the novel. This is a documentary. If you click on this in course documents, you can watch, learn a bit about Candy Darling, which I highly recommend. Also, now that we're here, as a side note, Shadowbahn refers to the ghost dance movement. And I've included these little short videos on YouTube here that kind of serve as an introduction to what that's all about, if you don't know. So those are also worth looking at. So in the novel, page 101, 102, 103, there's this kind of meditation on the ghost dance, which resulted in the massacre at Wounded Knee. And some people are speculating that the towers might be a kind of, it says monumental grave markers for what happened there. But yeah, we're not going to get too much into that right now, maybe in a later video. But we're concentrating on setting right now, which that certainly relates to the setting because, that's near where the towers have reappeared, obviously. But right now we're just kind of sticking to the broader strokes. But that being said, 1968 New York, Andy Warhol and his factory and that whole scene was a major part of that setting. Almost what you might say is like a culturally, it was a major force in defining the cultural landscape of New York City at that time. So it's worth educating yourself on that. It's also just, it's fun, it's weird, all that history. There's a lot of weird stuff that was going on, so it's not like a tedious history. It's interesting. So that's where we find ourselves with Jesse and this kind of in Shadow America #2. And again, these aren't Shadow America #1 is shaped, it's imprinted by the reality in which we live. Like, it's not completely different. There's the shape of our reality, of our true historical reality in which we live, shapes shapes the reality of Shadow America #1. And Shadow America #1, in turn, is imprinted into the shape of Shadow America #2, as is real America in which we live. We'll just call it America 0. Right. So in this reality, because Elvis wasn't born, the kind of rock and roll movement didn't happen. People are still listening to jazz, apparently. And Jesse Presley writes this review of James Paul and James Paul and the Beetlebubs, right? So it's kind of a play on words. You get it's J. Paul Ramon and the Beaglebubs. Sorry. So J. Paul is the John Lennon. Basically, he's what John Lennon became in this reality without Elvis to lay the groundworks of rock and roll to bridge that gap between. So the kind of African American music, this black culture. This music still happened in this reality. So like Little Richard, I think it might refer to Ray Charles in an oblique way. These guys, they they happened, but there wasn't an Elvis to kind of bridge the cultural divide, because so basically, even though this kind of black music existed, the black music in which rock and roll is really rooted, even though that happened because they were, you know, black artists in a racist America, they're the products of their art were never able to cross that divide into broader popular culture. There was just there's just kind of this little bubble that happened. But the thing that happened with Elvis, he bridged that gap, for better or worse. The real Elvis, we can get into that as a group, a kind of a group debate. But I would argue that he's racially problematic, which is a bit different from saying that he's a racist. He and many other white rock and roll people in the early days really kind of appropriated certain elements of black culture. And I say it that way because it's generally talked about the songs being taken and used, but I think it's even more than that. But there's kind of a difference between wanting to be part of something and being against it. So yeah, I don't think that Elvis is. I don't think he should be considered as a racist historical person. I don't think he should be considered as a racist, but as a racially problematic individual, or at least he's problematic in his relationship to racial issues, and that's a very complex discourse that is going on for some time, and I do want to get into that more with you all, but I kind of want to save that rather than just telling you what I kind of think about it. I want to try to get into that as a group in one of our group sessions, so I'm going to kind of set that aside for right now, and again just kind of try to focus on the settings. And the setting in Shadow America #2, rock and roll never happened because there was no Elvis. So stuff like the Beatles, they didn't happen. They had this kind of surge of popularity in Europe. There was this kind of blip, but they were a past trend, soon forgotten. And then you have J. Paul Ramon, again, who is John Lennon, kind of just going into this avant-garde territory. And there's this kind of weird thing that happens in that review that he writes. So he submits this kind of freewheeling, long, rambling review about J. Paul Ramon and the Beaglebubs. He submits this to Jazz magazine, which I think is called Around Midnight, if we can judge by the, I don't know if you can read that, but anyway, that's on page 109. We get this letter from the editor introducing this new album review, which is written by Jesse Presley about J. Paul Ramon and the Beetlebubs. And within that review, Jesse relates this incident where he encountered James Paul, and James Paul weirdly kind of knows who he is. It's not just that he knows who he is, he knows that he survived his brother Elvis, and that his brother Elvis died. And there's awareness of what the world would have been had Elvis been born instead of Jesse, and this thread of reality, if you will. Which again brings us back to that question of what is this exactly? What is Jesse exactly? What is he beyond a textual entity? If all he is and the parameters of this story is a textual entity, that is somebody, that is a character whose only foundations of being are within the text itself, that gives him a great freedom. It gives him, to only exist within a text that abides by its own, to only exist in a text that abides by its own internal logic. You have terrific mobility. If nothing else, you can really get around, and that's what we see Jesse doing. He's going from kind of different textual reality to different textual reality, and we have to pause and ask, what is he going into with this New York of 1968? Bearing in mind always, of course, that his emergence to Shadow America #1 was through the appearance of the Twin Towers in South Dakota Badlands, which we still don't really know at this point why that happened. And maybe we won't. You have to read on. You have to find out. But at any rate, is this New York City of 1968? Is it a dream? Is it a memory? Is it an alternate reality that has real substance within the narrative, within the story? Always bearing in mind that if I say something like that, I'm not suggesting that I'm not suggesting that this text is saying there is an alternate reality. Maybe it is, but that's not what I'm saying based on the text. But that within the text itself, within the narrative that is established by this text, there is a reality that is sustained within those boundaries, at least. Maybe not outside of those boundaries, but it exists in this arena of the text. This reality that is worth looking at and examining and trying to figure out what it means. Not necessarily what it means in an intentional sense, but figuring out what it means to us as readers. So this isn't a discussion right now we're having, because by the nature of how I'm trying to arrange this class during these weird times, I'm making this monologic video instead of having a dialogue with you. But I hope in your reply, that acts as some kind of dialogue. That's really what I want. I want to have a dialogue rather than just giving you my own interpretation. So I want to ask that question. Is this a dream? Is it a memory? Is it another level of reality within the overall reality of the parameters of the text of the narrative of the story? What is it? Does it only exist within Jesse's mind, whatever Jesse is, or within the boundaries of the book, within the boundaries of the narrative, does this Shadow American #2 exist outside of Jesse, and he's inside of it? Is he inside of it, or is it inside of him? Might be the simplest way to put it. And on page 107, we get this kind of suggestion of what's happening to him. Maybe not a suggestion, might not be the best word. We get a mention of, even if it's just a quite dubious mention, we get some kind of mention of what he's doing, of where he is, where he's going. It's on page 107. I'll just read it. So this is where we catch back up with him after he's basically jumped into that Andy Warhol picture. Is the way I read it. Pretty much, this is where we catch up with him after he disappeared on the top of the tower. So on page 107, with the heading out of the future, we find Jesse hurled from the South Tower rooftop across the threshold of his own image. Jesse has leapt from out of the future into his life, or has leapt into the life he might have lived, another version of his life, in which he's the shadow of no other man or event, but rather casts his own. Even as he has no actual sense of having lived it, he has a distinct memory of it, the life he occupied in his brother's place, in a country and century that only has known Jesse. He stops to look around at 47th Street before heading down 2nd Avenue, somehow knowing just where he's going, somehow knowing every way and turn. You know what? It's a little bit superfluous for what I want to try to keep focus on in this video, but I think it's just worth reading the next page as well. So I'm gonna do that. So it's with the heading Candy Says, New York City, 1966. I think I might have said 1968 before, but oh, right, okay. So this is him emerging into New York City of 1966 in a world where Elvis has never been born. Kind of emerging into his own chronology, where he seems to have already have a history. And he sends in the review that he writes for J. Paul Ramon and the Beetlebubs. That comes out in Shadow American #2 of 1968. But in 1966, Jesse has emerged and Jesse emerged into this world, into Shadow American #2, specifically New York City in Shadow American #2. And even more specifically, at 16th Street, Jesse cuts west toward Union Square, from where, when he gazes at the southwestern sky, no towers can yet be seen, their construction still somewhere sub-horizon. On his 30-block walk, now and then a passerby turns to look, as though Jesse might nearly be someone whom others would turn to look at. Just notorious enough to have achieved a fitful conspicuity. Now and then, as though he were just one more crazy person wandering through the New York City streets, he stops to shut his eyes tight, expecting the city noise around him to fade from sound. Expecting to open his eyes and find himself back on the tower rooftop, beneath the black flesh of a galaxy so close he can run a fingertip along the curve of the night as if down a woman's bare back. He knows, however, he really is here now, because he recalls it from before. There in the square, peering at the sky, he hears, "Jesse, darling," whispered in his ear by someone whom he remembers more instantly than he remembered his own name. But after all, Candy calls everyone darling, including herself. So that brings us, I just wanted to read that because that brings us back around to Candy darling, who, obviously I mentioned, but that's the passage in which she first appears. And it's also just beautifully written, so yeah. It's just worth reading passages from this book, I think, because they're so nice to the ear to hear. And I hope you're also finding it as pleasant to your palate as I'm finding it to mine. All right. On that note, I want to consider one more aspect of the setting of the novel, and that is the road. The road as a setting, which in some ways is tricky. It's hard to pin down a road. And there's also, I would argue, that there are some things about a road, especially a road made with the intention of bearing automobiles. There's something about a road for cars that makes it a distinctly American setting. And not just a distinctly American setting, but an especially American symbol. A symbol especially suited for America. And there are certain reasons that I say that. One is kind of loosely that the road is the road is in a way the setting of many a great American novel. I mean, Huckleberry, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, for example, if we want to be broad about what I'm trying to get at. They're going down a river, of course, but there's a way that the river in that story is analogous to the road. So if we update that to Jack Kerouac, his great novel On the Road in the 50s, there's a certain similarity between the river and the road, between Twain's River and Kerouac's Road. But there's also Cormac McCarthy, The Road. Let's see, trying to mobility. Steinbeck uses the notion of the road in a lot of things. Travels with Charlie. Dicks of Wrath has some. The road is important in that. There's something about. Well, part of it also is, there's that kind of mobility. There's that freedom of the road, which I think goes hand in hand with certain American ideals, or at least American mythologies. Um, and so that's why I encompass like Huckleberry Finn and his river in that. But a road meant for cars is even more specifically American, in that America was still relatively young when the automobile came into existence. You know, now, America is still relatively young today compared to a lot of other nations around the world. Um, whether it be China, England, um, Italy, Greece, what have you. These are older nations, and even just in terms of the built environment, of other places, especially European countries, but also some Asian countries and um, India. There's a built environment in those places that is very old, whereas the built environment in America, for the most part, is not as old because the people that were living here weren't building they weren't building things in stone so much. There was more of a fluidity, and even with that, just the mobility of a lot of Native American people also lends itself to the idea of a road and in the broad sense. Mobility is in many ways, I think, something that is essential to the American character. At least the option for mobility, the option to be free, to escape where you came from. We're a land of immigrants. So a lot of the people that populated this place and still populate it today are either immigrants themselves or within a few generations can say that they came from immigrants. So we're a nation of mobile people. But our built environment also is relatively young. Europe has churches and cathedrals that go back hundreds of years, and there's ruins. Uh, like China has the Great Wall of China, for example, the obvious example, or like Egypt has the pyramids, or even South America. There's like Mayan ruins and all that. You can go on and on and on. But America, the people that lived here were integrated into the natural landscape, and they, for the most part, they dwelled within the natural fluidity of the landscape, one could argue. And so the built environment of this country is very such that much of the built environment of America, as we know it today, was brought into being in conjunction with the automobile. I think that's pretty fair to say. If obviously people have been settling and building things for a while, but as it really started to expand and come together as a cohesive nation, it grew up with the road. And we're still developing. We're still in the very young stages of our built environment. And even in New York City, a lot of layout in New York City is determined by roads for streetcars, by roads for cars. So America kind of grew up with industry, with an industrialized landscape, with the automobile in a lot of ways. America was, it was just a little bit over a century old when the automobile was introduced, right? So, and it's only about 2.5 centuries old now. Obviously, settlers were building here, building kind of more solid concrete structures before that time, but there is an argument to be made that in a lot of ways America grew up with the automobile. And so a road for cars, I think, is distinctly American symbol, even though other places have, of course, other countries have roads for cars. But on a symbolic level, I think it's especially American. I would make that argument anyway. Perhaps you disagree. And if you do disagree, I would love to hear why. So I want to talk about the road as a setting. So of course, the book starts with this guy named Aaron. He's driving his truck on Interstate 90, which it's worth stating, Interstate 90 is the longest highway in the United States, the longest interstate highway in the United States, which makes it an even more potent symbol, and that it ties together the most ground, as you were. If the road crosses the boundaries, it acts as a kind of, we can envision it as kind of unifying thread. And if we begin to look at the road as a kind of symbol, as a kind of unifying thread, then I think making the longest road your setting is a good move. Because if it's the longest, it's the most binding, it's the most unifying, it covers the most ground. And every road is connected to every other. You can start up, you get on the road. I guess you could get on 90 in New York. Just go all the way across. It's a connective thread. It crosses these boundaries. So even in this disunited United States of Shadow America #1, where we start the novel, the road still transcends those boundaries. It still goes through those boundaries. There's checkpoints. There's boundary border patrols on state lines. But the road still goes through them. The road isn't actually broken up. It's still a cohesive, long, single thread. And we can see this with the music too. The music, much of the music that is discussed in the novel, and music in general, like that emanating from the towers, it's unifying. It's paradoxically both unifying and divisive at the same time. It's unifying in the sense that it's shared by all. That the musical landscape, the musical history, anybody can tap into it, and in its full diversity, it has shaped us as a people into what we are today. That's not to say that we all like the same music, that we're all even familiar with the same music, but there's an intertextuality. If you watched the last video, you'll know what that means. But there's a connection between all of American music in a way, that really unites us all through it as part of our shared cultural heritage, our shared artistic heritage. But on the flip side of that, it's divisive, and that every single song carries a multiplicity of meanings depending on the most basic level on who's listening to it, but then also, meaning changes through context. Uh, with Elvis, for example, talking about context. The songs that he's singing and profiting off of, I would argue, there's nothing inherently wrong with him singing songs that originated in Black culture. The problem is that when he's singing those songs and they're not being credited to the original artists, and the original artists are being deprived of the profits, of the rewards, of the fame, of the recognition, above all else, for that. That's really why it's a problem. But otherwise, racial boundaries in music, there's always been an exchange. And the divides, if you go back into the history of American music, most of the racial divides of music are not instituted by the artists, they're instituted by like record companies and people who are in control of the money. But again, that's a whole another issue. Maybe we'll try to get into that a bit more in one of our group discussions as well. That might be interesting for a lot of you to chip in. I would like to think about that. But yeah, suffice to say for now that the music, like the road, is unifying. It can also be divisive too. And I guess if you wanted to stretch that a little bit and make it a little bit more cohesive, you could say the road has certain divisive qualities in terms of that it allows a person to leave. It allows a person to leave the group into which they were born. And it's in that way, you could call it divisive as well as unifying. But Aaron switches to Highway 40 in the Badlands. So let me I'm going to show you this just so you have an idea. So we're still on the road, but he switches to Highway 40 as he often will do. Just so we have more of an idea of our setting, if you look with me on the map, I'm sorry, it's not Highway 40. He switches to Highway 44. So if you look here, he's traveling along Highway 90. He's near this. So this is Badlands National Park. That's where the tower appears. So it must be. It's probably somewhere around here. You can check back in the text, but it's going to be around there. Just so you have a bit of an idea there. So Badlands, you could call it, as another setting. And the Badlands, you want to talk about, like, that's where the ghost dance comes in as an important aspect of the setting, because it's in the Badlands. And, there's a certain history of westward expansion and stuff that comes with that. But I want to mention also another important road, specific road. As I said, all the roads connect. So in a sense, all the roads are kind of one. Uh, American road is all American roads, and that makes it this kind of is separate but connected, which I think is also a lot of the American ethos. Um, there's powers granted to the states, and there's powers granted to the central federal government. As a kind of tenet of it's one of the main tenets of democracy. It's this kind of staunch individualism, but of but individuals are united to each other through this common through the common welfare, the common consciousness, so on and so forth. The road, I'll mention another piece of American literature that the road is important is Walt Whitman. Song of the Open Road was notably, but a lot of his stuff. But Parker and Zima are siblings. Zima being adopted, the adopted sibling of Parker. They start their journey on. I hope you've heard of, even if you haven't been on it. It's very famous. It's also known, I guess, as the Will Rogers Highway. Will Rogers was a famous movie star cowboy. It's also known as the Main Street of America. It's Highway 66. It goes from, I think now it goes from LA to Chicago, but it used to go from Santa Monica to Chicago. So these siblings are starting out on Highway 66 with the intention of carrying through their mother's one-time wishes that the whole family would travel the length of Route 66, which is also referenced in a song, Chicks on 66. You might have heard that's alluded to on page 38, that particular song. It's one of the original highways in the U.S. It was a thoroughfare for people migrating west in the Dust Bowl. So it's deeply historic. It's rife with associations of Americana, with the freedom of the open road, with escape, adventure, the frontier. Those things being escape and adventure and new beginnings being essential to the frontier ideology. The frontier ethos is laid out by Frederick Jackson Turner. But it's notable in Shadowbahn that Parker and Zima deviate from their course off of Highway 61, and they do reroute their course entirely to go see the towers that have cropped in South Dakota. But even before they're aware of that, they turn off of Route 66 because of a bad encounter with border guards. I guess on the border of California, who take their water from their trunk. I guess it's contraband because it's not clear at that stage, but they're trying to take it over state lines. So it's confiscated, and I guess there's a drought going on. It hasn't rained in a while. There's sandstorms, and they just turn away. But we can interpret that perhaps as if Route 66 is a symbol of Americana, of the American mythology, the American narrative, then their deviation from that signifies a deviation from the intended American narrative. It's a deviation away from, the American mythology. It represents a kind of disillusionment that's happening as the reality of this narrative rubs up against the mythology of America, America as an idea. Right. So I want to draw your attention to page 53. Let's see what time it is. I'm trying to. Right. So I'll just read this because this is an important passage. If for nothing else, then this is where we get the title of the book from. Page 53. Zima says to her brother, "What do you mean, no?" As they near the Texas border. I-40 turns into a so-called throughway, federal interstate protected by chain fence, trespassing rupture territories marked by more disunion flags. Since checking out of the Barcode Motel, Parker and Zima have heard, on 3 different occasions, of a rumored thoroughfare, unmarked on any map, a secret highway called the Shadowbahn, that cuts through the heart of the country from one end to the other with impunity. So again, that's that kind of. I'll finish the page. Crossing friendly and crossing friendly Union and hostile disunion territories alike. Allegedly, the secret highway runs from an undisclosed western point to an undisclosed eastern, as though there is no America at all of physicality or fact, only the America of the mind. Whatever America that might be, to whatever mind might ponder it. And it goes on, but that's important. So this idea of this Shadowbahn, this shadow road, if we consider the road as an American symbol, and there's this kind of road that is said to unite, to travel with impunity across all the boundaries. I think at this point we can sort of look at that as a kind of signifier of the American mythology, of the American ideology, wherein all these separate parties are unified. They're individual but unified, as opposed to the reality within the parameters of this novel, wherein things are becoming disjointed, where there are territories of disunion, there's secession happening, or at least the threat of the attempts towards secession. I like to phrase it as the myth of America slipping on the ice, of the America as historical fact. That might be kind of a cool way to think about it. It's this story of America, the American narrative is becoming unraveled. It's becoming it's not aligning with the reality presented in the narrative and the novel. This idea of American unity, but in the story, America is becoming disunified, and we could say that reflects the increasingly severe points to which we as a nation and our reality in America zero might be approaching, and with our increasingly amplified polarizations, right? If that makes sense. The America that we live in, you as historical, real, fleshy people, is an increasingly disjointed, polarized America that is more and more out of alignment with American mythology, with the American narrative, with the ideologies laid forth by our founding documents. And we could argue that there's always been a disalignment between the founding documents and the words of the founding fathers and historical realities. I think that would be an easy argument to make. But one could also argue that we have, until a certain fairly recent point, perhaps, and there's lots of different arguments you can make. I'm just trying to make one, or I'm not even trying to make one, I'm just trying to present one, that we have been approaching an ideal, or we've been striving towards an ideal set forth by certain words in the founding documents. Certain words now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying what the founding fathers actually had in mind, but the words that they put forth instituted certain ideals that perhaps we have been striving for. And perhaps we've reached a tipping point where now we're going in the other direction, where we're becoming so polarized that we're slipping away from that ideal. And again, you could argue a lot of different things about that, but I just think that to accept that as the foundations of this novel can be helpful. So to accept that first as kind of a simple framework, and then once you accept that, you can make it more complex and complicated. You can pick at it a little bit, but we're just try to establish that. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with everything we've been discussing in this class about the American dream and the question of whether there is a disparity between the idea of the dream, the myth of the dream, you might say, and the dream as an attainable reality. There's this slippage. There's the dream. I'm always a bit annoyed when people argue about whether or not the dream exists or it doesn't. The dream exists. The dream is the dream. The dream is an idea that exists as an idea. But whether what it represents exists as an attainable reality, that's a different question altogether. And where those two meet up or fall apart, I think, that's one of the things that I've, that we've all been trying to get at over the course of this class. And this video has probably gone on too long, but I just want to finish with, I want to read you another, I just want to read you a passage and leave you in consideration of it. On page 124, this is the end of Jesse's review of J. Paul Ramon and the Beetlebubs. It's towards the end. So Jesse writes, I think maybe I'm done here, but you haven't yet read the final testament of the god of music, death. You haven't yet heard the final crashing note of my calamitous day of reckoning. I've just begun. Because when there's no point to a man who's liberated of any dictate or purpose, when a man is not just born out of his own time and place, but one for whom there's no time or place at all, that is a man truly unconfined, sir, a man on the loose. I will make my own point till there's no song to be heard any more by anyone, till the world is deaf to the most distant discant, and every last bird is throttled of its chirp, and the chiming of every passing breeze is asphyxiated, and no musical map exists free of what I map. I will make my own point, till not the land, but the map itself is the point. Okay, so just think about what that means, because I think that's kind of at the root of all of it. On that note, again, I know this probably went on too long, but you know, I hope to see you all next week and to talk about these things more in depth together as a group. I hope you're all well, and may you stay happy and healthy until we next speak.